We are now going to turn to news stories. And we've got some interesting ones today. So we're going to start with Venezuela, an update on Venezuela. So the quote-unquote official results, according to the Venezuelan government, are that Nicolas Maduro won the Venezuelan election with 51.2% of the vote, compared to the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez's 44.2% of the vote. However, the opposition has released strong evidence from voting tally sheets so that Gonzalez actually won by a big margin, 67.3% to Maduro's 30.4%. So that's a 37-point margin that the opposition is claiming from their evidence that Gonzalez has won by, which obviously contradicts the official Venezuelan results. And we obviously know that Venezuela has a history, or Maduro has a history, of manipulating elections. Now, for what it's worth, the U.S. government has officially declared Gonzalez the winner, and even Wikipedia, if you go on and search Venezuela 2024 election, has stated that Gonzalez has won the election with no asterisks attached. So that's interesting. Now, some more info for you. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed, Maria Corina Machado, who, if you recall from the last video, is the leader of the opposition, has said that she's in hiding and that her life is in danger. However, massive protests have also erupted in Venezuela over the seemingly manipulated election results. And this has resulted in, thus far, 11 people being killed in the protests, along with 1,000 or over 1,000 detained. Now, the new president doesn't officially come into office until January 2025. So we'll have to see what happens in due time. I'm going to adjust this slightly. 1 sec. Okay. Now, for what it's worth, my take is that protests will likely continue until at some point the force against the protesters becomes too threatening or too violent, that they just don't think it's worth it anymore and the progress is not there. And also, I think that for Maduro to even come close to agreeing to step down, international actors will have to get involved. And I really see two options for this. One is a military coup or an international coup d'etat, which, by the way, I think is an awful, awful idea. And the second one is that the international community will have to provide Maduro with high incentives to step down. I think this is the best option, and the U.S. and other governments should be working together to find an option that would be extremely lucrative to Maduro and would allow him to take it and step down. Now, of course, this is not my original idea. This is just one that I'm endorsing, and it was proposed in the New York Times article that I shared with you guys in my last video on Venezuela. Now we're going to go to the U.S. and Russia. So as many of you probably know, on August 1st, the U.S. completed a prisoner swap to bring back Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich onto U.S. soil. The deal also brought the following people back to the U.S. from Russian prisons. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, as I had mentioned, former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, Putin critic Vladimir Kara-Murza, and Russo-American journalist Alsu Kurmasheva. Now, in return, Russia received 8 prisoners: Vadim Krasikov, Vadim Konoshinok, Vladimir Kyushin, Roman Seleznev, Artem Pultsev, Anna Dultseva, Mikhail Mikushin, and Pavel Rubtsov. Now, Dultseva, Mikushin, and Rubtsov were all Russian spies and had fake identities and names. Interestingly enough, Mikushin was pretending to work at the University of Tromsø in Norway, pretending to be a Brazilian researcher, which I think is really interesting because it really makes you wonder, right? If he could do it and he's convicted, how many other are there, right? Like, is this something that happens as a regular occurrence that spies become professors at universities, at foreign universities? How often is it? I don't know, but it's a very interesting question, right? Like, how many of your professors, or were all your professors really who they said they were? It's an interesting question. I wonder if the U.S. does it too. Like, obviously, we wouldn't know about this stuff, but it's interesting. Now, Seleznev and Kyushin were convicted hackers. Konoshenok was accused of being part of a scheme to provide sensitive U.S.-made electronics and ammunition to Russian governments, as well as being part of a money laundering scheme. And then Krasikov, who was kind of the crown jewel, if you will, for the Russians in this deal, was a convicted killer, and he killed Zelimkhan Khangashvili, a former Chechen fighter, in broad daylight in the center of Berlin. He's also Krasikov is also a former member of the FSS, the Russian Secret Service Agency, and likely committed this murder under Russian orders. Now, some more info for you. Critics are currently worried that this is part of a growing trend whereby Russia arrests innocent people to free murderers or other high-level criminals, and that Russia will use this prisoner swap as evidence or motivation to keep doing the same thing. Now, it's worth noting a similar sentiment was expressed a couple years ago over the Brittany Griner swap when she was exchanged for arms dealer Victor Bou, whose nickname was the Merchant of Death. Now, according to Politico, the deal has caused significant blowback from certain European countries, especially Germany and Poland. Apparently, Poland wanted a Polish imprisoned journalist in Belarus to also be included in the swap, and Germany was wary of releasing Krasikov for such a cheap price. Previously, Germany had said that they were only willing to release Krasikov for Navalny. Now, as you guys know, Navalny is dead, so obviously something has changed. Now, it's worth noting that there are still 8 Americans detained in Russia that were not freed from Russia prisons. One of them includes Pennsylvania teacher Mark Fogel, who was arrested for illegal possession of marijuana, the same thing that Brittany Griner was detained for. So it's important that we don't forget about these 8 people and try to do our best to bring them back as well. Now, obviously, this is an interesting subject and one that a lot of people are going to have opinions on. Now, obviously, this, as it pertains to giving Russia and other foreign adversaries the incentive to unjustly detain Americans for lucrative or unfair deals to get those Americans back is the tricky subject. my opinion is that one needs to consider two things: allegiance to country versus allegiance to justice, and whether or not one cares more about the immediate moment versus the future. Now, I think if your allegiance is primarily to your countrymen, then you're probably more likely to say this was a fair deal, because you're getting innocent Americans back. But justice-wise, I think there's no way you could agree with this if you're just going by fairness and justice. The Russians got more people, higher level criminals, and gave way less. And then with regards to caring more about the immediate moment versus the future, again, if you care more about the immediate moment, then you'd probably agree with this deal because you're saying, well, we got people back, so that's really important. But again, if you look at the future, you're potentially opening up the door for more Americans to be detained in Russia and other foreign adversary countries. Now, obviously, the future is impossible to predict, so you're taking if you go based on what you think is the best in the future, you're obviously taking a gamble because it's unpredictable. But at the same time, right, you have to think about this in terms of a balancing act. Am I doing good in the moment by freeing these innocent people? Or does me freeing innocent people set up the door for more innocent people potentially to be taken and detained unlawfully or unjustly? And so it's just a matter of where your priorities are. That's all I'll say on this, but I think that's the discussion you need to have. Next, we're going to turn to Sudan. So, sadly, there's now officially a famine in Sudan. Or there was now officially declared a famine in the Darfur region of Sudan at the Zanzan refugee camp, where hundreds of thousands of people are currently living. The UN-affiliated Famine Review Committee, aka FRC, declared that famine has been occurring there since June. Now, this is only the third official declaration of famine since the creation of the organization 20 years ago, and the first declaration in 7 years. Altogether, because of the civil war and catastrophe in Sudan, more than 25 million people have suffered acute hunger, including an estimated 700,000 children suffering acute malnutrition, which is the most life-threatening form of starvation. Now, the criteria for the FRC declaration of the criteria of the FRC declaration of famine is when 30% of households have, quote, almost no food and cannot support their basic needs, and, quote, starvation, death, destitution, and extremely acute malnutrition levels are evident, end quote, in an area. Additional criteria is that more than 2 per 10,000 people are dying each day. Now, for reference, the famine in Somalia, which was in 2011, killed an estimated 250,000 people, with half of them being children under the age of 5. Now, the FRC has declared that the famine in Sudan is not due to weather or other natural causes, but it is entirely man-made. It is due to a lack of humanitarian access. Now, aid workers were last able to get humanitarian relief to the Darfur camps in April as the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, have the area under siege. Now, I don't have much else to say about this issue except that we need to do more to care about the situation and pay attention to what is happening to Sudan. We can't take our eyes off the ball. And we also need to care more about the rest of Africa because hunger is the most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, with 1/5 of the region experiencing hunger. Now, briefly, we talked about protests in Kenya last week. Now protests have erupted in Nigeria. Protests have erupted in Nigeria over what have been some of the highest cost of living in the country amid severe corruption from the government. As of Friday, August 1st, at least 13 people have died in conflict with law enforcement. Protests have also been inspired by previous protests in Kenya that we covered in the last episode. Now, for what it's worth, Nigeria has a corruption index of 25, which ranks 145th out of 180 for the most corrupt countries, according to transparency.org. And finally, the last news story, very briefly, is that in Turkey blocked Instagram access with no official reason. Turkey did not release an official reason for why they chose to block Instagram access, but it's likely over Meta's decision to censor some material over Hamas's leader Ismail Haniyeh's death in Iran. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Turkey also announced a day of mourning for the leader's death. That does it for the news stories.